My name is Eleanor Vance, though everyone just calls me Ellie. At my own family's dinner, my father raised his glass, smiled, and labeled me a leech in front of a dozen guests. No sarcasm, no hesitation. Just years of quiet disapproval, finally given a voice. But the very next morning, his own CEO stood up in a boardroom full of executives, looked directly at me, and said, "Good morning, ma'am." How could I be a ghost in my own home, yet command respect from the very people my family was desperate to impress? And what happens when the person they wrote off turns out to be the one signing off on their future? The moment I turned onto my parents' street, I felt it. That familiar tightening in my chest. The porch light was doing its usual thing, flickering a weak, hesitant yellow, as if it couldn't decide whether to welcome me or warn me to turn back. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves and distant wood smoke. I got out of the car, my heels making a sharp crunch on the gravel driveway, and I just stood there for a moment, taking a deep breath. It had been years since I'd last visited, but the house looked frozen in time, like a photograph someone was afraid to put away. Inside, the smell hit me first, that specific blend of lemon-scented cleaner and old polished wood. The third plank in the hallway still creaked, the one I used to jump over as a child. And then I saw the wall of photos, arranged with almost surgical precision. There were baby pictures of Nathan, his high school sports trophies, and a series of glossy family vacation shots. But there was not a single photo of me in uniform. Not one. Not even from my officer commissioning ceremony. It was like the version of me that mattered most had been carefully edited out of our family's history. My father, Robert, was already in the living room, pacing back and forth with his phone pressed to his ear, glancing at his expensive watch every 10 seconds. And there was Nathan, my brother, predictable as ever, standing by the fireplace with a glass of red wine, theatrically explaining some business strategy he'd likely heard on a podcast that morning. My mother, Helen, a master of social choreography, emerged from the kitchen with a perfectly practiced smile. "Well, look who decided to grace us with her presence," she said. It wasn't a hug. It wasn't even a real welcome. It was just a statement of mild surprise that I hadn't dematerialized on the flight over. I managed a tight nod. "Good to see you too, Mom." Her eyes immediately darted back toward her golden child. "Go on in. We're about to start a little presentation for Nathan's big promotion. He was just made senior director last month. Isn't that wonderful?" "Of course," I said, mustering a polite smile. The dining room was set for a state dinner. There were candles, intricate place settings, and even a small lectern set up for speeches. I scanned the table for a place card with my name. There wasn't one. I can't say I was surprised. I found the last empty seat at the far end of the table, near the swinging door to the kitchen, partially obscured by a serving cart. From this vantage point, I could observe everything without truly being part of it. The dinner started with a flourish of toasts and anecdotes, every story circling back to Nathan. Every laugh, every nod of approval was directed at him. I ate in silence, listening, just waiting. At one point, Helen leaned over to me and whispered, "Sorry we forgot to send a formal invitation. We just assumed you'd be too busy with whatever it is you do." I didn't bother to correct her. There was no forgot. I had texted her a week earlier to let her know my travel dates. She'd replied with a single thumbs-up emoji. A little later, Robert stood and tapped his wine glass with a fork. "To Nathan," he began, his voice booming, "for proving that success comes from merit, not from taking shortcuts." The room erupted in applause. Nathan raised his glass, a picture of false humility. Robert wasn't finished. "You see, some people have initiative. They build things. And then there are others who just coast along. And being a leech, well, that only gets you so far before people catch on. A few heads turned in my direction. There was a ripple of uncomfortable laughter. Forks paused in midair. Someone coughed into a napkin. I felt my entire body go rigid. He hadn't said my name, but the arrow had been aimed with perfect precision. The silence that followed his words felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. I felt my back straighten, and my hands instinctively steadied the knife beside my plate. Nathan let out a low chuckle. "Well said, Dad." I didn't say a word. I didn't even flinch. But deep inside, something fractured. It wasn't a loud, shattering break, but a clean, quiet split. I stared down at my plate, watching the candlelight dance in the reflection of the gravy. This wasn't new. It was a pattern. I remembered all the other times, the birthdays they'd forgotten, the graduation ceremonies they'd skipped, the way they'd quietly changed the subject whenever I tried to talk about my work, always dismissing anything that didn't fit into their narrow corporate worldview. The scholarship mistake. That's what they'd called it behind my back when I chose to join the military's officer training program instead of going to law school. She could have worked at a top firm, they'd lament. She could have been like Nathan. Helen leaned in close again, her voice a sharp whisper. "Let's not make a scene. This is Nathan's night." Of course it was. It was always his night. I just nodded, not in agreement, in calculation. After dessert was served, I slipped away from the table and stepped into the quiet hallway. The sounds of laughter and celebration faded behind me as I pulled out my phone and tapped through the encrypted work portal. The agenda for the next day's briefing was already there. Defense contract renewal, military-civilian integration project. And there it was, my name, listed in bold type. Colonel Eleanor Vance, Principal Advisor, Cybersecurity Command. They had absolutely no idea. I stared at the glowing screen for a second, my reflection superimposed over the framed family portrait on the wall beside me. A portrait from which I had been conspicuously absent for years. I whispered to the empty hallway, my voice flat but unshakable. "Let's see who's leeching off whom tomorrow." The slideshow began with the soft click of a remote, and the first image of Nathan's carefully constructed legacy filled the screen. He stood next to it, chin tilted up like a professor presenting an undeniable historical fact. Everyone in the room leaned forward in their seats. I leaned back. The first photo showed him in a cap and gown from his MBA program. The next was a handshake with some executive I didn't know. Then came a montage of office life, posed shots at corporate retreats, him in a corner office with a skyline view, him pointing at a whiteboard in front of an important-looking audience. They had even added a soaring, inspirational soundtrack, turning his career into a promotional video for a man who had already been declared a winner. I watched, my expression neutral, until slide 12. It was a group photo from his first startup venture. I remembered that day vividly. I'd helped fund it, secretly, an early investment check from a personal account I kept for just such occasions, to avoid any awkward questions. I had been in that original photo. I knew exactly where I was standing, in the back, to the left, with one hand on the whiteboard, my face partially turned. Except in this version, I was gone. The photo had been clumsily cropped. You could still see the edge of my sleeve and the glint of a watch I hadn't worn in years. That was all that was left of me. A digitally amputated presence, a deliberate erasure. I didn't react. I just took a slow sip of my wine. Helen clapped enthusiastically at the next picture, beaming as if she were the mother of a Nobel laureate. I just kept breathing, slow and steady. "Let's raise a glass," she announced, lifting hers high. To Chloe, for making all of this possible tonight. The food, the wine, the beautiful decorations. You are just a miracle worker, sweetheart. The room filled with a chorus of polite agreement. She's always so generous, someone murmured. I turned and looked at Chloe. She wouldn't meet my gaze at first, just stared intently at her wineglass. When her eyes finally flickered toward me, it was a brief, apologetic glance, but she said nothing. No correction, not even a slight shake of her head. Weeks earlier, I had wired Helen a couple of $1,000. She'd called me, complaining they were a bit short after Nathan's new car payment and the deposit for the catering. But she had made it clear that Robert was not to know she'd asked me for help. So I'd sent the money through Chloe's account. It was clean, untraceable. That's what family does, right? I raised my own glass. To Chloe, I said, my voice perfectly even. Nathan, who loved the spotlight, stood up again. I'm always telling my team, he declared, ideas are cheap. Success is about execution. Nobody remembers who had the original thought. They only remember who closed the deal. There were more chuckles, more nods. A few people from his office gave him a slow, admiring clap. A few eyes slid in my direction. Not staring, just quick, measuring glances, confirming my irrelevance. They were all complicit in this fiction where I didn't exist. I looked at Nathan. He was grinning, holding court, so comfortable in his fabricated world, so untouchable. I wanted to ask him, so when I wrote the check that funded your first prototype, was that just an original thought, or was that execution? But I held my tongue. I just tilted my glass and took another small sip. Chloe nervously reached for a napkin, fumbled it, and bent down to pick it up, avoiding my eyes for the rest of the evening. And that was the core of it, wasn't it? They all benefited from a version of reality that left me out. My actual life, my career, was inconvenient to their preferred narrative. A daughter in a military uniform didn't fit into the country club success story they wanted to tell. For Nathan to be a self-made man, they had to ensure no one remembered the sister who gave him his start. When the slideshow finally ended, the room applauded again. I smiled, a smile that didn't reach my eyes. My fingers found my purse under the table. I excused myself quietly, slipped into the kitchen, and found a pen next to the landline phone. There was a stack of starched linen napkins on the counter. I took one, smoothed it out, and wrote 3 words on it. Military Compliance Review. I folded it neatly, slid it into my bag, and returned to the table as if nothing had happened. As I sat down, I whispered to myself, tomorrow, there will be no cropping me out. The soft clinking of plates was the only sound as I stacked them in the kitchen, a rhythm that matched the heavy silence that had fallen over me. No one had asked me to help clear the table. No one even seemed to notice I was doing it. It was just a role I had played for years in this house. When you're invisible, you learn to move in the background. I rinsed a fork under the warm water, wiped it dry, and placed it carefully in the dish rack. My hands moved with a practiced mechanical calm, but my mind was miles away, drifting back to a cold winter night 8 years ago. I had just finished a project in an early RD unit and sent my father the blueprints for a prototype I had designed. It was a compact surveillance jammer, a device that would eventually become standard issue for secure communications across several branches of the service. But at the time, it was just a set of detailed schematics in a plain manila envelope with a short, handwritten note. Thought you might find this interesting. Let me know what you think. He never responded. A week later, I called to see if he'd received it. Helen answered and said Robert was busy. And honestly, Ellie, she'd added with a sigh, you should really focus on a career with a future. All this technical jargon, it just goes right over everyone's heads. So I dropped it. I filed it away in the mental cabinet labeled, "Things They Choose Not to Understand." As I dried my hands, I heard a fresh wave of laughter from the living room. It was Nathan again, holding court, likely boasting about some recent victory at work. I walked out and leaned against the door frame, pretending to check my phone. That's when I heard a voice I recognized. It was Mr. Davison, an old family friend and a senior executive at another firm. "Oh, Robert," he said, "that little gadget you gave me last year? It's still on my desk. A brilliant little piece of engineering. Everyone who sees it asks where I got it." Robert let out a self-deprecating laugh. "Glad you enjoy it. Just a rare find, you know." My head snapped up. There, on the mantelpiece next to the fireplace, sat a polished black case with metallic trim and an embedded microcircuit board visible under a glass plate. It wasn't a rare find, it was my prototype. He had repackaged my invention, my work, and given it away as a corporate gift, a conversation starter. I walked closer, not saying a word, just standing there, looking at it as if I were seeing it for the first time. Mr. Davison nodded toward it. "That thing is incredible. I swear it looks like something that came straight out of a secret government lab." I looked at my father. His eyes met mine for a split second, just long enough for me to see the flicker of recognition. He knew that I knew. Then he looked away. No explanation, no shame, no acknowledgement at all. I stepped outside onto the back porch. The cold air was a relief. My breath plumed in front of me as I stared out at the yard I used to play in. The lights from the dining room cast a warm, inviting glow, and I could faintly hear the murmur of conversation through the glass. Had they really forgotten everything I had ever done? Everything I had accomplished? Or was it just easier to pretend I was a blank slate? They didn't want the story of the daughter who worked with classified technology or the one who held 4 patents before she was 30. They wanted Nathan's simple, predictable corporate ladder. My life didn't fit into their picture frame, but that didn't mean I was going to let them erase it forever. Back in the guest room, I opened my briefcase and pulled out the project specifications for the next day's meeting. The very contract that Apex Dynamics was fighting to secure was built on a security framework I had helped architect. My name wasn't on the public-facing documents, of course, but the source code for the encryption layer was mine. Untouched, uncredited, but completely traceable. I didn't need their applause. I just needed them to finally be in a room where I was the one holding the pen. I placed the folder back in the briefcase, clicked the latches shut, and reached for an envelope I kept tucked in an interior pocket. It contained the original patent registration for the jammer, still valid, still mine. I set my alarm for 5:30 a.m., placed the briefcase by the door, and slipped the envelope into my purse. Then I stood in the darkness and whispered to the room, "If you refuse to remember me, I will make myself impossible to forget." I pulled into the corporate campus just as the sun was beginning to spill over the horizon. The first rays of light glinted off the glass and steel facade of the Apex Dynamics headquarters, sharp and unforgiving. I guided my rental car into the reserved parking space right by the main entrance. It was clearly marked, Military Liaison. I had requested it specifically. I stepped out of the car wearing my full-dress uniform. The fabric was perfectly pressed, the brass buttons polished to a mirror shine. This wasn't a costume or a statement. It was my job. 2 junior employees walking toward the building slowed their pace, their eyes widening slightly as I passed, before they hurried on with their heads down. The security guard at the front desk, a young man with a crisp uniform, immediately stood straighter. "Good morning, Colonel Vance," he said, then discreetly tapped his earpiece. She's on site." I gave him a single formal nod. "Thank you." Nothing more was needed. The lobby was already buzzing with the low hum of pre-meeting anxiety. People scurried about with coffee cups and tablets, the air thick with the scent of ambition and stale caffeine. I didn't scan the room. I knew exactly who would be there. And sure enough, there was Nathan, standing with my father near the reception desk, both of them wearing identical Navy suits, like a team uniform. Their posture was relaxed, confident. They were probably still debating what kind of government bureaucrat they'd have to deal with. Robert was likely lecturing Nathan, "Just be prepared for some old-timer from the Pentagon who doesn't understand the tech." And then the main elevator doors slid open. I stepped out. The chatter in the lobby died instantly. Nathan's eyes went to the rank insignia on my shoulders first. He didn't even recognize my face for a second. Robert looked, then did a double take. His mouth opened, then closed. His face twisted into a mask of confusion and irritation. "What are you doing here in that outfit?" he demanded, his voice a low hiss, caught between an accusation and pure embarrassment. I glanced at my watch. "Your briefing starts in 20 minutes. You should probably get ready." I didn't wait for him to reply. I just walked straight past them, my footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. The executive floor was quiet, carpeted in a thick, sound-dampening gray. The CEO's executive assistant met me by the doors to the main conference room. She offered a quick, professional smile. "Colonel, we have your place ready. Your nameplate is at the head of the table." I entered the room. It was all chrome and frosted glass, with a massive oak table that could seat 30. It smelled of money and power. And there it was, at the corner of the head quadrant, a polished brass nameplate, Colonel Eleanor Vance, Key Liaison, Department of Defense. I set my briefcase down and glanced at the presentation slides already loaded on the main screen. My secure communications overlay, my architecture, was slide 5. No one in this room would know its origin. That had always been the arrangement. At least it was, until now. Just as I was connecting my tablet, a notification pinged on the secure government network. It was an automated flag from our IT security. Unusual login detected last night. Access point, Apex Dynamics corporate IP, file accessed, internal military contract review, version 2, PDF. There was only one person in this building with the motive, the access, and the sheer arrogance to try something like that. Nathan. I didn't react. I didn't type a response. I just forwarded the flag to the audit division and mentally added it to the growing list. There would be no confrontation. Not here. Not yet. The room started to fill up with senior vice presidents, lead engineers, and civilian contractors. I stood by my seat for a moment, letting the quiet discomfort of my presence settle over them like a change in air pressure. Several people offered polite, nervous nods. One executive offered to get me coffee. I declined. Robert came in a few minutes later, his eyes darting everywhere but at me. Nathan followed, pretending to be absorbed in his tablet, trying way too hard to look casual. I watched as his eyes scanned the seating arrangement and landed on my nameplate. He looked utterly bewildered. He had not expected me to be seated anywhere near the head of the table. When the CEO walked in, the room went still. Chairs stopped shuffling. She gave me a single, respectful nod. Then she turned to the assembled team. And that's when Robert leaned toward me, his voice a stiff, angry whisper. "So, are you just here to observe?" I turned and looked at him. I really looked at him. "No," I said, my voice clear and calm. "I'm here to approve." I opened my folder. The room was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. I had just stepped out of the conference room to get some water when I saw her walking down the hall toward me. It was my mother, Helen, wearing that strained, tight smile she reserved for situations that were spiraling out of her control. Her heels made soft, apologetic clicks on the polished marble floor, as if her very footsteps were trying to be unobtrusive. She glanced over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching before she stopped in front of me, her hand already digging into her designer handbag. "Sweetheart," she began, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. I didn't want you to feel left out today." She pressed a small, plain white envelope into my hand, her fingers brushing against mine with a calculated gentleness. "Use this for yourself. Go get a coffee or a new blouse, something nice. Just maybe try to stay near the back of the room for the rest of the day, so Nathan doesn't get distracted." She smiled as if she had just performed an act of immense generosity, then turned and walked away before I could form a response. I didn't open it right away. A few minutes later, alone in a small alcove near the elevators, I slid my finger under the flap. Inside was not cash. It was a folded receipt for a $100 petty cash withdrawal from the company's administrative budget. The memo line read, "Guest discretionary." She had handed me embezzled company funds disguised as a peace offering, as if $100 could buy my silence and my compliance, as if that was a normal, thoughtful thing to do. I carefully refolded the receipt, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it into the inner pocket of my jacket. Not to keep, to log. I had already forwarded the IT security flag about Nathan's unauthorized file access. Now this. They weren't just trying to erase me from their story. They were actively trying to bribe me into obscurity. Back in the conference room, I returned to my assigned seat, right at the front section of the table, directly under the Department of Defense nameplate, the very spot my mother had just asked me to abandon. Nathan was at the other end, nervously swiping through slides on his tablet. When he saw me set my folder down, he let out a forced, brittle laugh, just loud enough for the junior executives nearby to hear. "What's in the folder, Ellie? More Army trivia? Are you going to give us all a pop quiz?" A few of the younger staff members chuckled uncertainly, looking to their superiors for a cue. I said nothing. Instead, I calmly opened my folder, turned it so the cover was visible, and placed a single document face up on the table in front of me. The gold seal of the Pentagon gleamed under the recessed lighting. It wasn't a theatrical gesture. It was a statement of jurisdiction. The laughter died immediately. No one asked what was in my folder after that. When the meeting broke for a brief recess, I found my father at the espresso machine, staring into his cup with the intense focus of a man trying to will himself invisible. I stood beside him in silence for a moment. Then, keeping my voice low but firm, I said, "One more stunt like that, and this stops being a family matter. It becomes a federal one." He turned slowly, the color draining from his face. "You wouldn't do that. Not to your own father." "I wouldn't do it to any father," I replied, "but I would absolutely do it to a contractor misusing federal funds and compromising the integrity of a defense project, and I am fully authorized to do so." He didn't have a response. He just stood there, his coffee forgotten, staring at a future that was suddenly and terrifyingly not going according to his plan. I walked back to the prep room, closed the door, and took one slow, centering breath. My hands were perfectly steady. My pulse was even. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about precision. I checked my watch. 11:57 a.m. I buttoned the top button of my jacket, adjusted my collar, and slid the compliance envelope from my mother into a folder labeled Internal Audit. No drama, just preparation. They thought this was a game of family politics. I was preparing a formal briefing. Outside, I could hear the rustle of people returning to their seats. I glanced at the day's agenda, posted on a monitor by the door. Presenter 1, Nathan Vance. I walked back toward the front of the room, my posture straight, and sat down with purpose. Let's see how well he performs without the answers he tried to steal. The conference room was nearly full when I returned, the low murmur of conversation failing to mask the tension that now hung in the air. I walked to my seat without looking left or right, though my eyes automatically scanned the room. The seats were arranged in a U-shape, with brass placards neatly positioned in front of each executive. Then I saw it. The placard in front of my chair. It read, "Guest of Robert Vance." I stared at it for a long, silent moment. I didn't touch it. Before I could even decide how to react, the CEO, Isabel Croft, entered from a side door. She was sharp and commanding in a tailored black suit, exuding a calm authority that only people who have fought for their position ever truly possess. Her eyes went from me to the placard. Without a word, she walked over, picked it up, and tore it cleanly in half. She pulled a pen from her jacket, took a blank card from her assistant, and wrote, "Colonel Eleanor Vance, key partner." She then slid it into the brass holder in front of me, as if correcting a minor clerical error. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. People who had been avoiding my gaze were now looking directly at me. A few moments later, Isabel stood at the head of the table. "Let's begin," she said. She turned to me first, her voice clear and carrying across the silent room for everyone to hear. "Good morning, ma'am. We're honored to have you with us today." Every sound stopped. The hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. The frantic typing of a junior analyst ceased. Nathan's hand, which had been resting on his mouse, froze. A muscle in his jaw began to twitch. My father didn't even blink. He couldn't. He just sat there, ramrod straight, his face a mask of stone. I gave a single, formal nod and opened my notebook. Without any ceremony, I began to outline the integration requirements for the new cybersecurity module, the same one that had already been field tested with 3 other government agencies. I noted discrepancies in their projected timelines, pointed out under-resourced security layers, and proposed a complete restructuring of the oversight protocol. I did it all in under 5 minutes. No one dared to interrupt. I wasn't being aggressive. I wasn't showing off. I was simply doing my job. Across the table, I could see Nathan squirming in his seat. He started to raise his hand, then seemed to think better of it and lowered it before anyone noticed. My father began scribbling furiously in his notepad, meaningless doodles I could tell from the angle. He was just trying to avoid making eye contact with anyone. I heard someone near the back whisper, just loud enough to be audible in the stillness. "Wait, I thought she was his daughter, or an assistant or something." The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. I continued as if I hadn't heard, laying out the deliverables for the next phase, the strict reporting structure we would require, and the layered access permissions for all internal staff. When I finished, I paused, letting my words hang in the air, letting them sink in. Then I looked up and added casually, "And just a reminder for everyone, all personnel security clearances must align with their actual project roles. Mislabeling staff access constitutes an operational risk." The words landed with the heavy thud of a dropped security manual in a library. No one spoke. Not even my mother, who fumbled with her pen, dropped it on the floor, and had to bend down to retrieve it with fingers that seemed to have suddenly grown clumsy. I closed my folder without a sound. The breakout sessions were scheduled to begin shortly. As people began to gather their notes and stand up, I rose, adjusted the cuff of my sleeve, and turned toward the exit. Nathan intercepted me by the door, his face a mottled mix of pale and flushed. "Why didn't you tell us who you were?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I leaned in, just close enough so only he could hear my reply. "You never asked," I said. "You just assumed." After the lunch break, the temperature in the conference room seemed to have dropped by 20 degrees. The forced smiles were gone. The polite nods had ceased. People were watching. Something fundamental had shifted, and they all knew it, even if they didn't have the full picture yet. I returned to my seat with a quiet sense of purpose. Nathan was 2 chairs down, pretending to review slides on his tablet, but I could see the slight tremor in his hands. He probably told himself it was just the caffeine. I knew better. The chair next to me, which had been occupied by a senior VP, remained conspicuously empty for a few moments. Then the chief operating officer filled it, his eyes darting between me and the printed agenda. "Colonel," he said with a stiff nod. I returned it with a cool, unreadable smile and placed my still unopened briefcase on the table beside me. I could feel their collective curiosity about what was inside it, a silent, gravitational pull. Nathan's name and photo appeared on the main screen. Next up, System Protocol Overview, presented by Nathan Vance, Senior Director of Technology. He stood, squaring his shoulders and clearing his throat with the practiced cadence of a man who expects to be listened to. His second slide appeared. It was a complex diagram of the secure communication interface that formed the core of the new system architecture. My architecture. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't interrupt. I simply lifted one hand. "That slide," I stated, my voice cutting cleanly through the air, was authored under the Digital ID EV Unit 7. It was submitted via encrypted channel to the Department of Defense RD Command exactly 11 months ago. The file hash and timestamp confirm its origin. The silence was absolute, surgical. Nathan froze mid-sentence, his hand hovering over the keyboard. "What?" I stood up, opened my briefcase for the first time, and retrieved a printed document. This is the original source code metadata, notarized by the Federal Project Registrar. I handed it directly to the COO. "You've been building your proposal on my framework," I said calmly. "I never asked for public credit. Until now." I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out another document, a copy of the Phase 1 investment contract, printed on heavy bond paper, sealed and countersigned. "Vance," I said, tapping the signature line at the bottom. "Initial strategic investor and security consultant. This signature has been in your company's digital archives for nearly 2 years." Nathan took an involuntary step backward, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an emergency exit that wasn't there. My father cleared his throat, his voice raspy. "There must be some kind of misunderstanding." I didn't grant him the courtesy of looking at him. "There isn't." The COO leaned over the document I'd given him, his brow furrowed. He looked up at the CEO. "The timestamp and digital chain of custody check out. It's hers, all of it." Vera said nothing. Nathan said nothing. I sat back down without another word. The room remained perfectly still for a long, uncomfortable moment, like a computer that had suffered a catastrophic system failure and didn't know how to reboot. Nathan eventually sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumped, his face utterly blank. He didn't even offer an apology. That was fine. I didn't want one. I wanted them to sit in the wreckage of their own assumptions. I wanted them to feel the weight of being wrong, not just morally wrong, but legally and professionally wrong. This wasn't about bitterness. It was about consequence. The COO finally started speaking again, saying something about next steps and future planning. I barely heard him. My mind was already elsewhere. A few minutes later, Isabel, the CEO, walked over to my seat. She didn't lean down or lower her voice. "Would you be willing to address our executive board tomorrow morning?" she asked. I closed my briefcase. "I'd prefer to do it today." The plaque was larger than I'd anticipated. It was made of brushed steel with a matte finish, and it was mounted on the main wall of the executive corridor, right between the boardroom and the internal media center. It was the kind of display you couldn't ignore, the kind you couldn't pretend hadn't always been there. Isabel, the CEO, waited until the very end of the day, after most of the contractors and junior staff had gone home, to unveil it. But all the senior executives were asked to stay. So was the board of directors. Robert, Nathan, and Helen stood among them, a small, silent island of tension in the quiet hall. Isabel stepped forward and pulled the velvet cover free. "National Partnership Heroes," the heading read in bold, engraved letters. My name wasn't at the bottom of a list. It wasn't tucked away. It was centered, right below the heading. The photo was from a formal commendation ceremony I'd never told my family about because they had been too busy to attend. I was in full-dress uniform, the silver insignia on my collar gleaming. The caption below it was simple: "Invisible until it mattered, then irreplaceable." There was no applause, no one gasped. There was just a heavy, profound silence. But it wasn't the silence of confusion. It was the silence of understanding. Someone behind me whispered, "She's the one who ran that EGIS prototype trial in Georgia." I thought that was an internal project. A camera flashed. Someone from the PR department was already getting shots for the next day's press release. Another executive pulled out his phone, murmuring that he needed legal to sign off on the new wording for the company website. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. My father stared at the plaque as if it were a personal betrayal. His arms hung limply at his sides. My mother stood a few feet behind him, too far away to fake pride, too close to feign ignorance. Nathan muttered something under his breath that I couldn't quite hear, something that sounded like, "We should have seen this coming." No one answered him. A moment later, Isabel turned to me. "Got 5 minutes?" she asked, her tone casual but direct. Her office was quiet and minimalist. She poured 2 glasses of water and sat across from me at a small table. "I'd like you to stay on," she said, getting straight to the point, "in an advisory capacity. Not just for this project, but for the whole division." I offered a small, soft smile. "Not because I'm bitter, Isabel, but I can't." She raised an eyebrow. "Because of them?" "Because they would spend the whole time asking why I didn't say anything sooner," I replied. "And I'm no longer interested in explaining myself to people who had already decided they knew me better than I know myself." She gave a slow, understanding nod. "Some things are loudest when they're said by others." We shook hands. She didn't press the issue. As I stepped back into the hallway, the energy had changed. People nodded to me now, not with the nervous politeness from before, but with a quiet respect, the kind you can't demand, you can only earn. Nathan and Robert were still standing near the main entrance. I walked past them without a word, but my mother followed me. She didn't call out my name, she just fell into step beside me. "If you had just told us what you were really doing," she said, her eyes welling up, "we would have been so proud." I stopped and turned to face her. "No," I answered calmly. "You would have told me to stop." Her face crumpled. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She just stood there, speechless. Outside the boardroom, I saw a young female intern standing in front of my plaque, her eyes wide with awe, a backpack slung over one shoulder. When she saw me walking by, she asked, her voice hushed, "Was that really you?" "It still is," I replied. I didn't look back. As I walked toward the elevator, I heard a voice in my head, soft but solid. They called me a leech, but today they worked to my standard. The elevator doors slid shut. Later that evening, just before the cleaning crew turned off the lights in the main corridor, my father stood alone in front of the plaque. His coat was slung over his arm, his mouth a thin, tight line. "You never needed us, did you?" he whispered to the empty hall. And somewhere, in the quiet space of my own mind, my voice answered him, low and steady. "I only needed to stop needing your permission." 6 months later, I stood in my own kitchen, stirring a pot of tomato soup. The rich scent of garlic and basil filled my small condo. The knock on the door came at exactly 7 o'clock. It wasn't an eager knock, nor was it a hesitant one. It was just scheduled. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened the door. My father, Robert, stood on the welcome mat, awkwardly holding a bottle of wine in one hand and a framed magazine article in the other. My mother, Helen, was right behind him, carrying a casserole dish wrapped in foil. And trailing a step behind them was Nathan, empty-handed, but looking like he had just come from a fresh shave. "Smells good," Robert offered, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. We weren't sure what to bring." I stepped aside. "Come in." It was just an ordinary Wednesday, not a holiday, not a birthday, just a moment that someone, somewhere along the line, had decided was long overdue. My living room was neat but comfortable. There was no military memorabilia on the walls, just art prints and books. Over dessert, store-bought lemon tarts, I sat back and waited. I knew a conversation was coming. I just didn't know who would start it. Helen cleared her throat. "We didn't know," she said, her eyes focused on the rim of her coffee mug. "What you had done, what you were doing, how important you had become." I nodded slowly and set my fork down. "You didn't ask," I said, not with accusation, but with simple clarity. "You didn't want to know." A heavy, respectful silence settled over the table, the kind of silence that says more than a dozen fumbled apologies ever could. Robert reached down and picked up the frame he had brought with him. "This hangs in my office now," he said, turning it so I could see. It was the article from a trade magazine about the Apex Dynamics partnership, featuring the photo from the plaque. My photo, my quote. He tapped the glass gently. "I should have done this with your commissioning photo all those years ago." I didn't cry, but I had to swallow hard before I could speak. "Thank you." Nathan, who had been quiet all evening, shifted in his seat. He looked down at his hands, then back up at me. "You weren't just ahead of us, Ellie," he said. "You were in a place we didn't even know existed." I smiled, not to forgive, not to soften the blow, but just to acknowledge the truth of it. "It was never about being ahead," I said. "It was just about being." The moment stretched, and then I stood up, gathered the plates, and walked to the kitchen. "I'll get the coffee." They stayed for another hour. We talked about small things, the weather, work, a friend of my mother's from church. My father asked if I was still running in the mornings. It was insignificant, but it was something. After they left, I locked the door, leaned against it, and let out a long, slow breath. A week later, I was at my desk at the Defense Command Center, mentoring a new lieutenant on compliance protocols. She asked me if it ever gets easier being underestimated. "No," I told her, "but it gets quieter." Sometimes justice doesn't come like a thunderclap. It arrives quietly, like peace. It fills the silence where the shame and anger used to be. They don't get to define me anymore. I do. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's a strategy. Sometimes it's what you need for survival. And sometimes it's the only way you can finally hear your own voice again after years of having it drowned out by others. I used to think that getting my family's acknowledgement would finally validate everything I had worked for. But what I discovered is this: respect hits differently when it's no longer something you're chasing, but something you carry within yourself. To anyone watching this who has ever felt underestimated, dismissed, or edited out of your own life story, I see you. Maybe your battle wasn't in the military. Maybe it was in a boardroom, a hospital, or just at your own kitchen table. But you know what it feels like to be overlooked, right up until the moment they realize they needed you all along. So I'll leave you with this. You do not need their permission to matter. You never did. Now, what about you? Have you ever kept a part of yourself hidden, your success, your struggles, because you just knew that the people around you wouldn't get it anyway? Share your thoughts in the comments below, or just drop a 1 if this story resonated with you. And hey, let me know where you're watching from. I'd love to connect. If this video moved you, if it sparked something in you, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. And if it didn't, tell me why. Every voice matters here. We're just getting started.